Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank the National Senate, Chamber of Deputies, and La Fundación Encuentros del Futuro for inviting me today. We've heard about some extraordinary biomedical interventions, biomedical research, and future applications of biomedical technology that's very exciting and promises to advance human knowledge and also to hopefully someday relieve human suffering. But today I'd like to talk about a different aspect. As a professor of law and bioethics, I'd like to talk about how we can together, through our democratic forms of decision-making, govern ourselves in a way that provides a regulatory scheme, an ethical scheme for the practice and investigation of these very exciting developments. And the question that prompted my talk is in some ways an upsetting question. It's a question that is rooted in American experience of exploitation and abuse of vulnerable populations, intellectually disabled children, poor African Americans living in the American South, elderly people suffering from dread diseases. The question that I began with that animated my talk today is why do the laws regulating science, medicine, and biotechnology so often fail to protect the weakest and most vulnerable, the disabled, children, the elderly, the poor, and racial minorities? Here are some images you see from the sad history of American public bioethics. And what I would like to suggest today, at a very broad level of abstraction, is that the reason that the law fails to protect the weak and vulnerable in some instances is because in some instances the law is built on a vision of human identity and human flourishing that doesn't capture the full complexity and lived reality of the human experience. Law fails when it is, to use my colleague Alistair McIntyre's phrase, forgetful of the body. When the law is built on a vision of the human that doesn't take into account the fact that all human beings are embodied beings. We are all organic, living, and dying bodies. And that essential aspect of humanity has important implications for how to think about human flourishing, to how to think about how we stand in relation to each other and what we owe to each other. And to explain why I believe that's so, I will shortly give a very brief definition of the field of law and policy that is most relevant to this question, what I call public bioethics. I'll say something very briefly about the unavoidable normativity of law itself. All law is ultimately normative, and I'll say more about what that means in a second. I'll then pivot to talk about why I think what I'm calling the anthropological question is so essential to wise, just, and humane law and policy, why the law must ask the question, and those of us who are responsible for making the law must ask the question of what vision of the person lies at the heart of these legal principles, doctrines, regulations, and rules. I'll talk about the risk of law built on an anthropology that is forgetful of the body, that doesn't take seriously enough the inexorable reality that we are embodied living beings. And then I'll briefly mention or gesture towards what I hope is a solution to that problem, to augment the impoverished vision of human identity that can make the law go in the wrong direction by remembering our embodiment, by thinking about what it means to be and flourish as a being that is embodied, that is a body, not doesn't have a body, but is a body that's fragile, that gets sick, that gets injured, and a body that dies. And then I'll offer finally a conclusion about metrics that we can all use, and especially our lawmakers can use to analyze whether or not the law that they pass and enact or consider is wise, just, and humane in light of the truth of human embodiment. So very briefly, let me say what I mean by public bioethics. I mean quite simply the governance of science, medicine, and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. And it's unavoidable. Every law that we have that relates to medicine, biotechnology, and biomedical research takes a particular normative perspective, which I'll talk about in a moment. But fundamentally, what bioethics is about, public bioethics, the law and policy in this domain is about, is questions of human vulnerability, dependence, frailty, and finitude. It's about procreation and pregnancy and babies and wasting illnesses and devastating injuries, desperate enrollees in clinical trials, fearful patients, the disabled, the elderly, the dying, and even the dead. Put another way, public bioethics is most deeply about the meaning and consequences of human embodiment. The fact that we experience ourselves, one another, and the world around us as living and dying bodies. And there are many issues in public bioethics that you are all already familiar with. So I'm going to move to the proposition that all law, and sometimes as a law professor you hear people say, well, we need to keep law and morality completely separate from one another. Well, it's certainly true that not every moral question should have the law involved. But it's not true, and in fact I think it's unintelligible to say that law itself needs to be neutral as to principles of right and wrong, good and bad. Every law, no matter how basic or banal the law is, aims at a particular good to be pursued, a particular harm to be avoided, or perhaps even punished. Every law is normative. Every law aims to promote a good or ameliorate or deter or even punish a wrong. And as a result, law reflects the goods, including ethical goods, that people care about in a given community. It reflects the goods and harms that they're concerned about. And it doesn't merely reflect those goods and harms, it also helps people to learn, and for better or worse, it constitutes people's understanding of right and wrong. And even more deeply than that, as I said a moment ago, every law presupposes a vision of human identity and human flourishing. Yes, those are contested matters. People disagree strongly about those questions. But you can't have law without presuppositions about what a person is, about what human flourishing is, and ultimately what we owe to one another. And because law at bottom is about the protection and the promotion of the flourishing of persons, it unavoidably rests upon usually unstated conceptions of human identity. And therefore, the deepest way to understand law that touches and concerns the biosciences is to ask what I'm calling the anthropological question. What is the vision of the person that lies at the heart of these legal propositions? Who and what does the law assume we are? And what constitutes our flourishing and thriving? And there's a risk that I've already alluded to. There's a risk of forgetting and ignoring the fact that part of human identity is our embodiment, is our status as living, breathing, embodied beings. Now, to be sure, we are an integrated unity. It's what Hans Jonas called a psychosomatic unity of mind and body, an integrated unity of mind and body. But if you simply prioritize thinking about the mind, you can go wrong, and if you build law on top of that, you're going to leave important and vulnerable populations behind. And one particular risk in this area is to reduce the person to an isolated, unencumbered, what Charles Taylor calls atomized individual self, to describe the fundamental unit of reality as the individual abstracted and separated from any constitutive or definitive attachments that he or she might have, and to define the person solely and exclusively as a mind and a will with an instrumental body, with instrumental relationships, and in some cases even an extractive relationship to other relationships in the world around us. And human flourishing within this framework, within this, I argue, partially true, but ultimately impoverished framework, is that human flourishing is reduced simply to pursuing the projects of one's own will, of one's own construction. It's about an imperative to live your originality, to interrogate the depths of your own sensibilities, construct a life plan and pursue it without regard to constitutive relationships, without regard to what I think are, in some cases, even unchosen obligations or constitutive attachments that we have to others. A view that thinks of personal relationships as transactional and instrumental and views individuals as isolated wills in a world sometimes of collaboration, but also in a world of strife. And it reduces principles of ethics merely to the good of autonomy, which is of course important, but it's not the only ethical good. It's not the ethical good that would have helped those intellectually disabled children that were exploited and abused in the United States that I mentioned a moment ago. And it reduces injustice simply to the constraint on one's own freedom to pursue projects of your own choosing. And the role of government and law becomes limited and reduced to the proposition that the role of law is simply to remove those constraints and provide the conditions for the assertion of the unencumbered will. Now, these are all very important things. The mind is important, the will is important, freedom is important, particularity is important. But that's not the whole story about who we are, what human beings are. Every human being begins his or her life in a state of complete and utter dependence upon others for his or her very survival. And in the best case scenario, we begin a gentle trajectory upward to the height of our powers where we can exercise agency and autonomy and then immediately pivot back downwards to a state of total dependency again. So the vision of identity that forgets the body is only a snapshot of one moment in the life of the individual human being where we're capable of exercising agency and autonomy. And it privileges those who are most capable of agency and autonomy, the most privileged, the richest, the most able members of our community. When there are people among us, friends and neighbors, family members, who are dependent perhaps at major disruptions in their lives where they become totally dependent on others, accidents, disabilities, there are some friends and neighbors and brothers and sisters and mothers and daughters who are dependent for their entire lives because they have a particular state of disability that afflicts them. So yes, freedom and particularity are essential, but they're not the only story. The full story of what an embodied being needs for thriving is not simply freedom, but instead what Alistair McIntyre has described as networks of giving and receiving. Why? Because as embodied beings, fragile, finite, limited human beings, our body makes us vulnerable. Our body subjects us to natural limits, and our body stands us in particular relationship to others, a relationship of reciprocal dependence and indebtedness. Alistair McIntyre puts it this way. He says, all human beings exist on a scale of disability. And so what human beings as embodied beings in time need to flourish is not simply freedom. We do need freedom and autonomy, but not simply freedom and autonomy. What we need are networks of people, networks of giving and receiving of people who are willing to make the good of others their own good without seeking anything in return and without counting the cost. Every person in this room is here because as a baby, somebody decided to take care of you, to make sure that you had what you needed, to give you everything that they had to support your life. For most of us, it was our parents. And that was not because we had to earn the right to be cared for or that they had a contractual obligation to care for us for some sort of return on investment. It was intrinsic to the relationship itself. Networks of giving and receiving. We need them for basic survival, but then we also need them for what I argue we are meant to become. We are meant to become and learn to be the kind of beings that can take care of one another in these networks. We are most human when we are caring for one another. Put a different way, human beings, by virtue of their embodiment, are made for love and friendship. And to sustain these networks of giving and receiving that McIntyre talks about, we have to have certain kinds of virtues and practices, what McIntyre calls the virtues of acknowledged dependence. The virtues of giving include the virtue of just generosity, giving to the other in proportion to his or her need, simply in proportion to his or her need, not seeking anything in return. The virtue of hospitality, welcoming the stranger because he or she is a stranger. The virtue of misericordia, which means taking the suffering of another person and taking it on as if it were your own suffering. And this is illustrated in a beautiful way in some of the presentations we heard earlier from medical doctors. In the context of healthcare, misericordia is an essential virtue. But also the virtues of acknowledged dependence include the virtues of grateful receiving. The virtue of gratitude, chief among it. The virtue of gratitude, being grateful, realizing that everything is a gift, that we don't earn everything that we have. In fact, we stand in relation to those, it's their beneficence that allow us to flourish. And that engenders a sense of humility, an ethic of giftedness, openness to the unbidden, tolerance of imperfection. The principle of solidarity, it helps us to see our connections to others. The principle of human dignity, that we all are fundamentally equal. The virtue of truthfulness. In fact, all these virtues of acknowledged dependence, of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving can all be understood under the aegis of friendship, rightly understood. It's friendship that ultimately people need for their flourishing. We need networks, and so the fundamental question, I argue, for those of us in our democratic forms of government and those who are charged with governing us, and those, including those who convene this extraordinary event, the question that they always and that we always have to come back to when we're considering regulation, law, policy in this particular area is how does this law create, support, and sustain networks of giving and receiving on which embodied human life depends? How well or poorly does this legal proposal, this doctrinal principle, these statutes, these regulations shore up and sustain these networks of giving and receiving, which take place in private spaces, by the way. It takes place in families and communities, as well as under the aegis of official state action. Then the question we have to ask is, who are we leaving behind? Who are we leaving behind? How do the weakest and most vulnerable fare under the legal framework that we're considering? We don't simply make policy and law for the most privileged among us. We think downstream to those who are not privileged, those who are weak, those who are voiceless, those who can't operate according to the flourishing that I described to you earlier by thinking about what they want to do, configuring a plan and pursuing it. People who are profoundly disabled, people who are poor, people from discrete and insular minorities. Who are we leaving behind? And then finally, the last question that I think we should always ask in this domain is the legal framework we're considering, is the policy that we're thinking about to advance these very exciting goods from biomedical science, biomedical research, the application of biotechnology, does the law, the regulatory scheme, enlarge or shrink the boundaries of the human community and the boundaries of human concern? And I would argue that we want to open up the boundaries, enlarge the boundaries of human concern, enlarge the boundaries of the human family, to welcome everyone, to not exclude those who are inconvenient, to not exclude those who Pope Francis describes as part of a throwaway culture. And so if we ask these questions, if we ask questions that take seriously our fragility and vulnerability in human embodiment, and we ask how well or poorly are we building up these networks upon which we all need to survive and flourish and thrive, who are we leaving behind, and are we making the circle of humanity wider, or are we making it narrower? Then I think we will pursue these goods in a responsible, thoughtful way, and hopefully enjoy their great fruits from these amazing presenters that we've heard today. So thank you all very much, and good evening.